Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We discussed this morning the final verse of chapter 2, canto 2, text 37. Pibantiye Bhagavata Atmanak Satam Katam Natam Shavanapuштeshu Puteshu Samvritam Punanti Te Vishaya Vidutshitashayam Vrajanti Tachcharana Suroruhantikam. Those who drink pibanta, those who drink through oral reception, fully filled with the nectarian messages of Lord Krishna, the beloved of the devotees, purify the polluted aim of life known as material enjoyment, and thus go back to Godhead, to the lotus feet of Him, the personality of Godhead. Tat charana saroru ha antikam. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The sufferings of human society are due to a polluted aim of life, namely, lording it over the material resources. The more human society engages in the exploitation of undeveloped material resources for sense gratification, the more it will be entrapped by the illusory material energy of the Lord, and thus the distress of the world will be intensified instead of diminished. The human necessities of life are fully supplied by the Lord in the shape of food, grains, milk, fruit, wood, stone, sugar, silk, jewels, cotton, salt, water, vegetables, etc., in sufficient quantity to feed and care for the entire human race of the world, as well as the living beings on each and every planet within the universe. The supply source is complete, and only a little energy by the human being is required to get his necessities into the proper channel. There is no need of machines and tools or huge steel plants for artificially creating comforts of life. Life is never made comfortable by artificial needs, but by plain living and high thinking. The highest perfectional thinking for human society is suggested here by Shukadeva Goswami, namely, sufficiently hearing Srimad Bhagavatam. For men in this age of Kali, when they have lost the perfect vision of life, this Srimad Bhagavatam is the torchlight by which to see the real path of life. Srila Jiva Goswami Prabhupada has commented on the Katamritam mentioned in this verse, and has indicated that Srimad Bhagavatam to be the nectarian message of the personality of Godhead. By sufficient hearing of Srimad Bhagavatam, the polluted aim of life, namely lording it over matter, will subside, and the people in general, in all parts of the world, will be able to live a peaceful life of knowledge and bliss. Paragraph. 3 more paragraphs. For a pure devotee of the Lord, any topics in relation with his name, fame, quality, entourage, etc. are all pleasing. And because such topics have been approved by great devotees like Nard Hanuman, is interesting. Hanuman, in his list, Nanda Maharaj, and other inhabitants of Vrindavan, certainly such messages are transcendental and pleasing to the heart and soul. That's one sentence is a paragraph. Next paragraph, also one sentence. And by constant hearing of the messages of the Bhagavad Gita and later of Srimad Bhagavatam, one is assured herein by Srila Shukadeva Goswami that he will reach the personality of Godhead and render him transcendental loving service in the spiritual planet of the name Goloka Vrindavan, which resembles a huge lotus flower. Final paragraph for the chapter. Thus, by the process of bhakti yoga directly accepted as suggested in this verse, by sufficient hearing of the transcendental message of the Lord, by sufficient hearing of the transcendental message of the Lord, the material contamination is directly eliminated without one's attempting to contemplate the impersonal virat conception of the Lord. That's chapter 1. And by practicing bhakti yoga, if the performer is not purified from material contamination, he must be a pseudo-devotee. For such an impostor, there is no remedy for being freed from material entanglement. Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purports of the second canto, second chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, the Lord in the Heart. So yesterday morning, we did a little review of the flow, the questions by Shukadev, because yesterday's verse was the direct Sanskrit of a response to the question. Shrinvata, Shrotavya Kirtitavyascha. The verse is Dhyaya Pujas Tanityada. This ends Smartavya Bhagavan Rinam. Smartavya Bhagavan Rinam. So it's a direct response to that question. What is that subject matter that should be always heard and chanted, remembered? And pujas cha. So the messages are worshipped because the messages are non-different than the person. Transcendental sound vibration is non-different than the person who that sound vibration is glorified, glorifying, or from whom that sound vibration comes, as in Bhagavad Gita. It's philosophically, it's an interesting thing, but spiritually, it's a fact. And provided one hears as it is, or hears Krishna's words as opposed to some twisted interpretation, this means that kind of understanding, then the purification is built into the process of simply hearing. One time I was in New Jersey, and there was a Bengali family that had lots of Bengali friends, and I thought, these are newer people, best to just stick to something simple. So I took something simple from Bhagavad Gita. First question, one of the gentlemen raised his hands. Can you give some interpretation on that? And then I immediately understood that that's what he's used to, that this means that, rather than the direct meaning. There's this means that, the interpretation, twisting the meaning, because people that are scholarly, some people, many people that are scholarly, they like to interpret. And in fact, that's what makes them distinguished, because they can interpret in a different way and then another in a different way, and then it becomes confusing. Prabhupada described he was visited by, I can't remember the title, something like the mayor of Calcutta or the police commissioner or something like that. And the person visiting him wanted to know, why are things so chaotic? And Prabhupada attributed it because people don't accept. He went to the Chaturvarnam because the social organization is not recognized. It's being rejected as the caste system, and let's, do it over again. But in principle, the ruination, the degradation, ruination is one of the symptoms, is not taking what Krishna says or what's spoken about Krishna. Just this morning, I was listening to Prabhupada speaking in Johannesburg, and somebody said, "How can I know God?" That was his question. And Prabhupada's answer was very simple. He said, if you want to know me, you may have an idea of who I am or ask somebody who I am. But if you want to know who I am, I'll sit down with you and spend substantial time, and then you'll know who I am. And who can be a better person to know who I am than me? So this is a worldly example, but Krishna is revealing who he is. If you want to know God, read Bhagavad Gita and don't interpret. So I'm spending some time with the interpretation component of hearing, but when there isn't interpretation, instead it's just descending knowledge, Krishna says, and one says that Krishna says. Quite simple. Quite simple. Quite simple. And then we make things complicated unnecessarily. A qualification for a teacher, teachers need to be inquisitive, and the questions of the inquisitive go to their teacher. And when their teacher makes reference to the predecessor teachers, that's just fine. And then one can understand by that method, disciplic succession method. But supposing somebody has another tendency, there are people that have another tendency, and then they like to speak something. And part of at least their idea of something that's attractive is another something. It must have been a very interesting experience for Prabhupada, taking the message of Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita all over the world and meeting people from different cultures and different backgrounds that have some other idea. Because who doesn't? Everyone has some idea, and that some idea is likely to be other than Krishna's idea. And, that's an obstacle for understanding, because you hear with filters. You hear according to your conception of things. So how to get free from that holding one's conception of things? I'll just give a little example because it's on my mind, something I've, in the past 4 or 5 days, been helping to address. So this is from China. There's a devotee who has taken the assignment of creating a Bhakti Shastri course for China. So they went to Vrindavan, spent 2 years, English is not their main language, but they heard all the classes in English and did their best to understand it. And one of the things that became clear was that when you go back to Russia or some other South America or China, you might have to modify the curriculum because it has to be able to be intelligible by the local people. But this is an English medium curriculum. So they went back to China, created a curriculum with other teachers that are experienced devotees and experienced in teaching, and they've kind of recrafted, I don't know exactly what they did, to give it Chinese characteristics. So fast forward, they now have a program of training teachers, a teacher training Bhagavad Gita group. Persons had to apply, they were interviewed. And one of the rules is to see if you've understood what's the responsibility of a teacher. You get an opportunity to say back what you heard. And part of the purpose is to make sure that the teachers, that once they go out there and teach, they're going to be teaching what they heard. Because there's a tendency to not teach what you've heard, but to teach what your conceptions are and call it Bhagavad Gita. So it's a very good model. And there's one gentleman who's a member of that teacher training Bhakti Shastri course, and he has some liking to add things. And one of the sections that they were discussing of late is from the 7th chapter, where the worshippers of the demigods go to different places than Krishna Loka. And they go to the planets of the demigods. And so there was a feedback from this gentleman. Then, what about, and I don't know the name of the figure in Chinese culture that had 1,000 arms and so many eyes. So is that those who worship that person in Chinese culture, are they worshiping demigods? That was the question. And then the devotee who was the teacher didn't know. So they asked an authority. They asked the GBC, who's Chandrasekhar Prabhu, who went to school at the Bhaktivedanta Academy in Mayapur. And, he's now serving as a professor. He's a well-educated devotee. So his answer was, this particular person with Chinese name is not a demigod, but this person is known in Chinese culture as a sage. So that's what was said in reply to the group. He's not a demigod, he's a sage. The person went and started blasting. 1,000 arms and heads and eyes, and he's not a demigod, the sage. So he's just mixing the hearing in disciplic succession methodology in the manner of being trained as a teacher. He wants to interject something that's not, and there's no harm to ask such questions, but he took exception to the answer without even. So that's just one example. Now, different cultures are going to have different conjectures, and it goes on. And our responsibility is to hear, and certainly one can ask till the cows come home, no problem. But the answer should be from our predecessor acharyas. From our predecessor acharyas. And this, not all topics are discussed by our predecessor acharyas, so we don't go into speculation land and start cherry picking. We can continue to research to see what our predecessor acharyas have to say. And that's so. I'm just commenting because it's part of this text. The method of becoming purified is simply hearing messages of transcendence, messages specifically Srimad Bhagavatam, or specifically messages, nectarian message of Lord Krishna, the beloved of the devotees. And then it purifies, that hearing purifies the polluted aim of life, known as material enjoyment. Mental speculation is one of the material enjoyment parties. Let's have a mental speculation party. And people go and dance in the mental speculation room and come up with different ideas and then present their different ideas. And that's one of the polluted aims of life. It's not as gross, it's more subtle, but it's a polluted aim of life. So what's the cure for the polluted aim of life? This verse is a continuation from the previous verse, Shrotavyas kirtitavyas cha smartavyo bhagavan nrinam. And when it's heard properly, it corrects the polluted aim of life. The polluted aim of life, what's the aim of life? And then what's the polluted aim of life? What's the aim of life? Or, put it in different language, who are we? The aim of life is to know who you are. To know who you are. Very, very simple. I've been repeating this many times, but I'll repeat it again. In the video, the film that Yadubar and Vishaka made about Prabhupada, one little section, I've been saying it not correctly, so Yadubar, I discussed it with him in Alachua, and he's going to send me the audio file. It's an audio interview. Interview introduces Prabhupada, and then the questioner says, what's the aim of life? And Prabhupada's, the aim of life is to know who you are and make a solution to the otherwise existing problems, birth, death, disease, and old age. So then the interviewer repeated, so you're saying to know yourself, Prabhupada, to know yourself, interviewer, to know yourself. It's like really clear. So you can know yourself, you can unpack it, it becomes many things. To yourself is not independent from knowing the world around you, what's your place in it, knowing the Supreme, from whom you've come, and our natural, eternal spiritual nature to be a servant of God. That's to know yourself. If that isn't awakened, swanus tatak pungsang, vishvaksena kata suya, notpadiyad yadiratim shrama eva kevalam. If that understanding of who God is and how to love Him isn't awakened, that's the polluted aim of life. It may even go under the name of some religion. Without knowing who God is and awakening love for Him, it's a polluted aim of life. Or another way of saying the same thing is dharmasya or dharmaglani. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, I just listen to Prabhupada a lot. Glani means discrepancy. Discrepancy in dharma. What's dharma? Dharma is the essence of a living, an essence of something. The dharma of sugar is it's sweet, etc. Dharma of chili is it's hot. The Dharma of water is its liquid. The Dharma of living entity is service. And in the purified stage, it's paradharma, it's service to God. So service propensity is there, supposing it's misguided. That's dharma glani. So when the aim of life is misguided, that's materialistic life. And it's what's out there to be the enjoyer of, and God's not in the picture. Senses, sense objects, and it can also be the mind and the objects of the mind, and let me be the enjoyer and have a dance, enjoying subtle or gross senses. Polluted aim of life. How to correct it, restore the proper aim of life. That's the awakening of our dormant Krishna consciousness. And the awakening of our dormant Krishna consciousness clears away the polluted aim of life and awakens the unpolluted aim, or the natural, spontaneous, natural to the soul service to the Supreme. And then it spans over all the aspects of life. Our eating, our music, the things that people do. If they don't have a proper aim of life, they do those things. And the things that have a proper aim of life, they do those things. But in relation...
Wikipedia. Gordon Matthew Thomas Sumner CPE, known as Sting, is an English musician, singer, songwriter, and actor. The mic's off.
Okay. The polluted aim of life is directed towards those things. Krishna is not in the picture. When Krishna is not in the picture, I'm the enjoyer, or when I'm thinking I'm meant to be the enjoyer of, then it's the polluted aim of life. And the emphasis in the purport here is resources of nature. And as long as there's this focus on taking the resources of nature and mixing them or manipulating them in such a way that the end result is sense enjoyment, that's the polluted aim of life. It doesn't mean don't engage the resources of nature. Engage the resources of nature. Engage the resources of nature in such a way that the natural way of life in relation to Prakriti is, it leads to a higher consciousness. It leads to wellness. It leads to balance of life, of how we apply ourselves and our interests in life and so forth. Guru Prasad Swami and I discovered, we were around the same time, there's in Kerala, there was a Dr. Pillai, common name, who was a naturalist Ayurvedic doctor. And his reputation was twofold. He was very, very, very skilled at diagnosis, pulse, and this is the problem. And the second thing he was well known for was he would personally go into the forest, not take an assistant, he would take an assistant to train, but he would personally gather the herbs from the forest because then they weren't spoiled, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's more, he found and taught, there's greater potency when it comes in that way from nature, and then knew how to smash it or powder it or whatever he had to do to make the medicines. He was a good doctor. Very, very old. No one continued. He learned from his father, and his son wasn't interested. His son was interested in technology and machines, and etc. So it's not continued, and so in course of time, such wisdom of how to interact with nature in such a way, wellness is there, and elevation of consciousness is there, and the mission of life can be more naturally achieved. When those things are aligned with the proper mission of life, then it's very nice. When those things, the mission of life helps to realign even when things are out of whack or skewed. That's the Bhagavatam's, the principle that it's founded upon. This age of Kali is misaligned. And it helps to restore the proper aim of life. And then gradually, according to different cultures, I mean, Prabhupada is here speaking about machines in a derogatory way, yet at the same time, Prabhupada used machines. He wouldn't have spread Krishna consciousness as rapidly as he did without the use of machines, using airplanes and using microphones and recording systems and dictaphone and transcribers and printing books, printing press. You know, it's all the use. The problem is not per se in technology or machines. It's what the over-reliance upon technology and machines does to people, does to their aim of life. There's a risk involved in engaging the senses with the objects of the senses. There's a risk involved in not doing so, because where's the contentment? Where's the nature of our tendency to serve Krishna and are having a set of senses through which we can serve Krishna? So doing and not doing has a risk. Then so how to do where it's without a risk? Exactly the language that Prabhupada was using in the class I was hearing this morning. It's risky life. Not hearing, not receiving Krishna's direction, it's a risky life. That was the language he was using. It's not that if one is a devotee, there's no risk. One of the risks is while engaging the senses with sense objects, one may become again inclined, or one may continue to be inclined to be the enjoyer. The contamination is within. It's not in the activity itself. The contamination is within. So continue to hear. Read the Bhagavatam coming from printing press. Technology is there. Hear recordings of Prabhupada. That's technology. And but with the purpose of reawakening the proper aim of life. It happens, but the risk involvement is diminished by hearing very carefully, knowledge and disciplic succession, purposefully. Purposefully is not just to gather knowledge so you can be honored as being a knowledgeable person. The purpose is that's a risk. Not hearing is also a risk, but hearing with the right purpose. That I want to know Krishna, I want to be in my relationship with Krishna, I've forgotten, I want to reawaken that dormant consciousness of my relationship with Krishna. And then having been touched that way, to share with others. Then we don't have polluted aim of life. So to get to that restoring, that's the message of this verse in Purport. Those who drink through oral reception purify the polluted aim of life known as material enjoyment, and thus go back to Godhead, to the lotus feet of Him, the personality of Godhead. Last, this message in the Purport, first paragraph, Srila Jiva Goswami Prabhupada has commented on the Katamritam mentioned in this verse and has indicated that Srimad Bhagavatam to be the nectarian message of the personality of Godhead. So that's the Kata Amrita is the very literature that we're hearing from. Katamritam. By sufficient hearing of Srimad Bhagavatam, the polluted aim of life, namely lording it over matter, will subside. And the people in general in all parts of the world will be able to live a peaceful life of knowledge and bliss. And that was Prabhupada's aim, was bringing that to the world. And he was empowered to do it, and he was totally dedicated to do it, to achieve that purpose with much sacrifice. Of course, we know that, but it's always good to remember it. So whatever sacrifice we may do, it's a drop in the bucket or a drop in the ocean of the sacrifice that Prabhupada made for the world. As an empowered person, naturally, he was successful. But that empowerment was given to him because he had the spirit and had the purity and the care of Krishna Shakti. So we should try to hear carefully, receive it, and repeat it as we heard it, with faith that that's going to be beneficial for myself and whoever hears. That's our life. Let's see if there's some discussion. Yes?
So this Chinese model that you mentioned,
Yeah.
most of the Chinese, they don't have any background
In terms of?
religion or Krishna himself. So how do we make sure that the message doesn't get lost in the translation from what is there? Like I often wonder, we have got Bhagavad Gita in so many different languages, and a lot is dependent on the person who actually puts it in that language.
Yes.
Because even one word misunderstood can change the meaning of that entire purport.
Well, that has been a problem, by the way. I don't know the detail, but the topic of how to translate consciousness, what's the Chinese word that matches that meaning? For example, then there's two groups. There's this group and there's that group. And they, to this day, they don't agree. However, the one that translated it initially is a bit of a maverick, and that person who is the bit of a maverick doesn't care for what other, the 16, 20 other learned persons in China say this is how it should be translated, because that is not what the real meaning is. So there's risk. It's one of those things that I've heard Hari Parshad Prabhu say many times, that there's not always, one can do one's best. It's from Bhaktivinoda Thakur, language has its limits. And Sanskrit is pristine, and any translation of Sanskrit is going to be less than pristine because it's the language itself. What to speak of the shades of meaning, because Sanskrit words can have different meanings, although there's dictionary definitions of Sanskrit words. There's shades of meaning, and the different meanings in whatever the language may not actually capture the meaning. So there's a risk. But you can say, even for people that know Sanskrit and they don't know this language, that language, they can also misinterpret according to their, the modes of nature and their conditioning. So there's that risk as well. amongst those that, taught from the Sanskrit itself in Sanskrit. Shankaracharya taught in Sanskrit. He didn't translate it into some, Chinese or English or anything. And he derived different meanings and refused to discuss anything other than in Sanskrit. So there's risk in any case, whether you go this direction, that direction. Therefore, the correction, the course correction is disciplic succession, and trust in Krishna that he'll guide those who are sincere. He'll guide those to come to him. But there's purification in any case, provided it's in coming into. So that's like newer people. I remember the first time I was asked to give a Bhagavad Gita class. I was nervous as all get out. It was the situation was the BBT. Then it was ISKCON Press. Workers had a midday class. I was asked to give their midday class, and Jayadvaita Swami was in the audience. So it was supposed to be 40-minute class. I spoke for 15 minutes, and that was it. And I asked him afterwards, how did it go? If I was really nervous. He said, well, you just repeated what you've heard. You didn't create something else. You did. Well done. That's the principle. Now, very new. So what was my realization of what I spoke? But just speaking what I heard. So there's a chance even speaking what I heard is not exactly what I heard because of filters. But the authorization to speak, being requested to speak, not pushing oneself anyway, and then the purification that comes, and the speaker can become more and more and more. So that's the course correction for the possibility of skewing things this way or that way.
So is it safe to say that this is a person who knows English and knows his own language and he has access to, say, Bhagavad Gita, for example, in his language and in English? It's better that he reads the English because it's from Prabhupada.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Rather than
But Prabhupada wanted it in all languages, and he was.
If there is someone.
Sure. And some of there are devotees that are translating from English to Chinese are, they're modifying things as they go along. From, this is a better Chinese word than that one. As they become purified. That's what, so there's risk, for sure.
The second question I had, Maharaj, was we hear this term, Prabhupada mentions it many times about a pseudo devotee.
About?
A pseudo devotee.
Pseudo devotee.
Yeah.
That's hard language, isn't it?
It's very hard. How do you really know what exactly is a pseudo devotee? Who do you?
Time. I mean, the genuine versus pseudo is the intention. And intention over time, that's a genuine devotee. There may be whatever, covered in different ways, guna and karma covered. But if there's sincerity, Krishna takes responsibility for that person. So you see over time. Now, supposing there's someone that's sincere, and so they're not a pseudo devotee, but then supposing that genuine devotee starts to get some bad association or starts to become slackened or something like that, then they may want to carry on with some pretense that nothing has changed when something has changed. they're dishonest to themselves and certainly to others, then that's pseudo. So my response is it has everything to do with one's intention, not to do with the immaculate execution.
Krishna Maharaj, I have one question on the interpretation. So we hear a lot of times devotees share the Prabhupada quotes, or like in discussions, like they'll say, "Oh, Prabhupada said this, Prabhupada said," and then some of the times we know the time and place,
Yes,
but most of the times we don't know circumstances, like what was he took,
Correct.
to whom he took, and what was the devotee's condition at the time.
yes.
And then it must be like very directed to that particular devotee.
That's one of the risks of saying Prabhupada said. There's more.
Maharaj. So, in the beginning of the spiritual journey, like if these quotes of Prabhupada's are like shared or discussed, so we don't get the context of the circumstances.
I got the
most of
point.
time.
Now, so what to do?
Yeah. So, and then when we discuss, like sometimes, like, so when there is conflict of interest also, conflict of understanding also arises, because when two devotees discuss that, they think that they both understood it in a different way and they are correct and things like that. So
I'm
we
very familiar with that territory. So now, how do you
avoid?
process that kind of situation? That's your question.
Yeah.
There's different things that one can do. Part of what you're saying comes back to what Shambhihari said. What's in Prabhupada's writings is a better standard than Prabhupada said. That's a higher standard, because if he says something here in context and something over there, so become knowledgeable in Prabhupada's books. Then another is become familiar in course of time, which takes time, but with the broader context of what was his message. Because sometimes, even in his books, even in one sentence, he'll say this and say that, which looks like, So how to understand, it takes some maturity, it takes some familiarity with his teachings. And when you hear the Prabhupada says, best is you hear from someone who's mature and someone who's not simply on a bandwagon to persuade this point of view as opposed to that point of view, but somebody that's mature. They have the big picture. And this is simply an illustration, with or without the context. This is simply an illustration of the big picture. But many persons who will make such references will also balance it with, in other circumstances, you said other things, just to acknowledge there are other perspectives, even from our founder Acharya, on the same topic. So all of that, in short, it takes maturity to process. So be cautious to get on this bandwagon and say, if this is right, then that's wrong. Because there are many situations where they can be both right, and we don't understand how to reconcile. So that takes maturity, and someone that's not mature isn't going to respond maturely. They'll doubt, or they'll pick sides, or something, and that's immature behavior. That's what happens if you're immature, so if you're trying to, the response to your question, how do you process when you hear step back and allow that there may be multiple explanations there, and without knowing the context, I don't put as much weight in what Prabhupada said, without knowing the context and without knowing the big picture of what our founder Acharya view was on something. Here's one example that comes to mind. One devotee accepted sannyas. There were two devotees in Vrindavan that took sannyas at the same time. One, Prabhupada said, now that you've taken sannyas, your business is to travel and preach. The other, he said, now that you've taken sannyas, you should manage in Vrindavan with renunciation. Same time, two different people. So you don't know the context or the people, then you take this one or that one, and that's it. So it becomes, be careful to get the big picture of how Prabhupada directed the organization, and become especially familiar with what's in his books. So that's the best guide. Something else? Anything online? No. Okay, Prabhupada ki